Have you ever felt like something was watching you from the trees? The Pacific Northwest holds secrets most people never want to discover. I'm bringing you 11 true horror stories from the fog-shrouded forests and isolated coastlines of Washington and Oregon. These aren't legends or campfire tales. These are documented encounters that will make you question ever hiking alone again. Before we begin, drop your location and current time in the comments below. Let's see who's brave enough to watch this after dark. If you're ready for stories that'll haunt you for weeks, hit subscribe on Bleak Fears, and let's dive into the darkness together. You need to understand something about me before I tell you what happened in October of last year. I'm not some weekend warrior who stumbles through the woods with a brand new REI backpack and zero experience. I'd been doing solo backcountry trips for 7 years. I knew how to read trail markers, purify water, navigate without cell service, and most importantly, I knew how to recognize when something was wrong in the wilderness. Olympic National Forest was my backyard. I'd hiked the same 22-mile loop at least a dozen times. So when I tell you that someone followed me for 3 days straight, staying just out of sight, but leaving evidence everywhere I stopped, you need to believe me when I say this wasn't paranoia. This was real. I started the hike on a Thursday morning in mid-October. The forecast called for fog and light rain, typical Pacific Northwest fall weather. Perfect conditions, actually, because it meant fewer people on the trail. The parking area was empty except for my Subaru. I signed the trail register, shouldered my pack, and headed into the dense forest. The first day was textbook perfect. I covered about 8 miles, saw 2 black-tailed deer, filtered water from a crystal-clear creek, and set up camp near a meadow just as the sun started dropping behind the ridge. I ate my dehydrated pasta, hung my bear bag, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through old-growth cedars. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. The second morning, I woke up at dawn and immediately knew someone had been near my campsite during the night. Now, before you think I'm overreacting, let me explain what I found. My tent stakes on the east side had been pulled up slightly and repositioned. Not by an animal. There were no claw marks or disturbed soil patterns you'd see from a raccoon or deer. These stakes had been lifted and placed back down by human hands. I could see the fresh finger impressions in the damp soil. My bear bag line had been loosened and retied with a different knot than the one I'd used. Someone had gone through my food while I was sleeping 10 feet away. I stood there in the cold morning air, my breath fogging, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe another hiker came through late, saw my camp, and was just checking to make sure I was okay. But why wouldn't they wake me? Why would they touch my gear? I checked my pack. Nothing was missing. My water filter, headlamp, first aid kit. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, except for one thing. My trail map had been unfolded and refolded incorrectly. I'm obsessive about my maps. I fold them a specific way so the current section faces out. Someone had opened it, studied it, and folded it back wrong. They knew exactly where I was going. I should have turned back right then. Every logical part of my brain screamed at me to pack up and hike the 8 miles back to my car. But here's the thing about experienced hikers. We have this stubborn pride. I'd planned this route for weeks. I had 4 more days of food and perfect weather. I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought and messed with my own gear half asleep. It sounds stupid now, but in that moment, I wanted it to be anything other than what it actually was. So I broke camp and kept hiking deeper into the backcountry. Around mile 12, I stopped to filter water at a creek crossing. That's when I saw the boot prints. Fresh boot prints in the mud on the opposite bank. I froze. These weren't from yesterday's rain. These were from this morning, maybe an hour old. I looked at the tread pattern carefully. Vibram soles, size 10 or 11, probably a men's hiking boot. Deep impressions meant the person was carrying weight, likely a full pack. But here's what made my stomach drop. The prints stopped at the creek, exactly where I was kneeling, and then disappeared back into the forest on the same side they'd come from. Whoever this was had walked to the creek, stopped, watched me from across the water, and then retreated before I arrived. They were tracking my pace. I stood up fast, scanned the tree line. Olympic National Forest is dense. I mean suffocatingly dense in some sections. Walls of ferns, moss-covered nurse logs, hemlock, and Douglas fir trees packed so tight that visibility drops to maybe 20 feet. Someone could be standing 30 yards away, and I'd never see them. I called out, "Hey, is someone there? Do you need help?" My voice sounded small and pathetic in all that green silence. No response. Just wind and the creek burbling over rocks. I filled my water bottles as fast as I could and got back on the trail, moving quicker now. That afternoon, I covered another 6 miles and found my next campsite. It was a designated spot near a small alpine lake, one of those breathtaking Pacific Northwest scenes with mirror-still water reflecting jagged peaks. Normally, I would have spent an hour just sitting there, decompressing. Instead, I set up my tent in record time, scanning the forest every 30 seconds. As the sun started setting, I heard it. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, boot steps on packed earth. Rhythmic. Steady. Coming from the trail I'd just hiked. I grabbed my bear spray and stood outside my tent, heart absolutely hammering. The footsteps got closer, maybe 100 yards out, then 50. Then they stopped. Complete silence. Whoever it was had frozen just out of sight. I yelled into the trees, "I know you're there. Show yourself." Nothing. Just my own echo bouncing back. I waited 20 minutes, bear spray in one hand, knife in the other, barely breathing. The footsteps started again, but this time they were moving away, back down the trail. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with my headlamp off, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something circling my campsite. Slow, deliberate steps in the undergrowth. Not trying to hide anymore, just walking a perimeter around me, maybe 40 feet out, like they were establishing territory. This went on for an hour, then silence. When dawn finally broke, on day 3, I made a decision. I was getting off this mountain. I didn't care about finishing the loop. I packed everything in under 10 minutes and started hiking fast toward the nearest exit trail, a route that would cut my trip short but get me to a trailhead by evening. I was done playing whatever game this person wanted, but here's where it gets worse. Every single place I stopped to rest, I found those same boot prints. At a switchback where I paused to catch my breath, fresh prints in the dirt. At a fallen log where I sat to eat an energy bar, prints on the opposite side, facing me. This person was staying parallel to me, watching every move, and they wanted me to know it. By early afternoon, I was practically jogging. I'd covered almost 9 miles in 4 hours, way faster than safe with a 40-pound pack. My knees were screaming. I didn't care. I just wanted out of those trees. Then I reached the junction where the exit trail split off from the main loop, and I saw something that made me stop cold. Sitting on a rock right at the junction was a protein bar, my brand, the exact same kind I had in my pack. It was placed deliberately, wrapper folded back halfway, like someone had taken a single bite and left it there for me to find. That's when I knew this wasn't some random hiker. This person had gone through my food bag that first night. They knew what I was carrying. They'd been planning this. I ran. I don't remember much of the last 5 miles, except branches hitting my face and my pack slamming against my spine with every stride. I hit the trailhead parking area just before sunset. There were 2 other cars there, which meant people, witnesses, safety. I sat on the bumper of my Subaru shaking for 20 minutes before I could even get my keys out. I drove straight to the ranger station and reported everything. They took my statement seriously, sent a patrol out the next morning. They found the protein bar exactly where I described it. They found the boot prints. But they never found whoever was following me. The ranger told me that Olympic National Forest spans over 600,000 acres. People disappear in that wilderness. Some are found, eventually. Some aren't. He said I was smart to trust my instincts and get out when I did. He also said something that still keeps me up at night. He said, "You're the third person this year who's reported being followed on that specific loop trail. Same MO, same boot prints. We haven't caught anyone yet." I asked him what happened to the other two people. He paused, then said, "They made it out too. But one of them had items go missing from their pack that they didn't notice until later. Personal items, photos, a journal. Someone is still out there in those woods, and I don't know what they want or when they'll escalate from stalking to something worse. I haven't been back to Olympic National Forest since that trip. My gear is still packed in my garage. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that protein bar left at the trail junction. The message was clear. I know what you have. I know where you're going. I could have done something, but I chose to let you leave. This time. If you hike solo in the Pacific Northwest, check your campsite in the morning. Look for signs someone's been there. Trust that feeling in your gut when something's wrong. Because the wilderness isn't what you should fear most out there. It's the person who knows those woods better than you do and doesn't want to be found. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in alternate dimensions or time loops or any of that paranormal garbage you see on cable TV shows. I'm a civil engineer. I work with concrete numbers, measurements, physics. So when I tell you what happened to me on Highway 101 between Cannon Beach and Manzanita at 2 in the morning last February, I need you to understand that I've spent the last 8 months trying to find a rational explanation. I still don't have one. I'd been in Portland visiting my aunt, who was in hospice care. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I'd spent 3 days watching her fade, sitting in that terrible fluorescent hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and death. On the third night, around midnight, the nurse told me I should go home and get some real sleep. My aunt was stable. There was nothing more I could do tonight. So I left, completely drained, feeling like my brain was wrapped in cotton. I got in my Honda Civic and started the 2-hour drive back to my place in Seaside. Highway 101 along the Oregon coast is beautiful during the day. At night in winter, it's a different animal entirely. Twisting 2-lane road, sheer drop-offs to the ocean on one side, dense forest on the other. No streetlights, no other cars most of the time. Just your headlights cutting through the dark and the constant sound of waves crashing hundreds of feet below. I'd driven it 1,000 times. I knew every curve, every mile marker. It was almost meditative, the familiarity of it. Around 1:30 in the morning, just past Cannon Beach, I drove into fog. Not unusual for the Oregon coast in February. Marine layer rolls in thick as soup some nights. But this fog was different somehow. Denser. It didn't gradually thicken like normal coastal fog. I literally drove from clear air into a solid gray wall in the space of 10 feet. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 yards instantly. I slowed down to 40 miles per hour, turned my hazards on, and kept going. Standard procedure. The fog would break eventually. It always does. Except it didn't break. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes in that soupy grayness, following the white line on the edge of the road because I couldn't see anything else. Then I passed a landmark I recognized immediately, an abandoned pickup truck that had been sitting on the shoulder for years. Rusted-out Chevy, sitting on flat tires, someone's permanent roadside fixture. I'd passed it thousands of times. It marked the spot about 3 miles south of Cannon Beach. I made a mental note and kept driving. 10 minutes later, I passed the same truck again. Same rust pattern on the hood, same missing tailgate, same exact position on the shoulder. I actually said out loud in my car, "What the hell?" I checked my odometer. I'd driven 11.2 miles since entering the fog, but if I'd just passed the same truck twice, that was impossible. Maybe there were 2 identical abandoned trucks. Unlikely, but possible. I kept my eyes locked on the odometer now, watching the tenths of a mile tick up. 11.3, 11.4, 11.5. At 14.8 miles, I passed the truck a third time. Same truck, same spot. I know because this time I stopped and got out. My hands were shaking as I put the car in park. The fog was so thick I could barely see 5 feet in front of my face. I walked up to the truck and touched it. Freezing cold metal. Real. Solid. I looked at the license plate, memorized the numbers. Oregon plate, 847 KDL. I got back in my car, wrote it on my hand with a pen, and checked my phone. 2:17 a.m. I'd been driving for over an hour and a half. I should be nearly home by now. Instead, I was stuck in some kind of impossible loop. I pulled up my GPS on my phone. That's when things got really wrong. According to the GPS, I was 43 miles south of Cannon Beach. That would put me well past Manzanita, almost to Tillamook. But I'd only driven from Cannon Beach. I watched the GPS recalibrate. The blue dot showing my location jumped erratically on the map, like it couldn't figure out where I was. Then it settled on a spot that showed me in the middle of the ocean, half a mile offshore. No signal. Error message. I tried to call someone, anyone. No service. Completely dead. I started driving again, faster now, up to 55, even though I could barely see. I didn't care. I needed to get out of this section of road. The fog pressed against my windows like something alive. The headlights seemed to stop working properly. The beams just vanished into gray nothingness about 15 feet ahead. And then I noticed something that made my stomach turn inside out. My fuel gauge hadn't moved. I'd been driving for almost 2 hours. My Civic gets about 30 miles per gallon. I should have burned through at least 3 or 4 gallons. The needle was still sitting exactly where it had been when I left Portland. 3/4 full. I looked at my dashboard clock. Still 2:17 a.m. I looked at my phone. 2:17 a.m. But I'd been driving for at least another 15 minutes since I stopped at the truck. Time wasn't passing correctly. Or it was passing, but nothing was changing. I was moving, but not getting anywhere. Burning miles on the odometer, but not consuming fuel. Driving forward, but passing the same landmarks. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this violated every physical law I'd ever studied. The terrified part was screaming louder. That's when I saw the figure standing in the road, right at the edge of my headlight range, maybe 20 feet ahead. A person. Just standing there, in the middle of my lane, facing me. I slammed on the brakes and my car skidded to a stop about 10 feet away. I could see them clearly now. Dark coat or cloak, hood up, completely motionless. Not moving at all. Not even swaying. Just perfectly still in the middle of Highway 101 at 2 in the morning in fog so thick you could choke on it. I sat there with my foot on the brake, engine idling, staring at this figure. I couldn't see a face under the hood, just darkness. They didn't move, didn't step aside, didn't acknowledge my car at all. I honked my horn. Nothing. The sound seemed muffled, absorbed by the fog almost instantly. I honked again, longer this time. The figure slowly raised one arm and pointed to the right, toward the ocean side of the road. Not at me, just pointing. Then they lowered their arm and stood motionless again. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't drive around them without going into the oncoming lane, and I had no idea if another car was coming from the opposite direction. I couldn't see more than 15 feet. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then the figure began walking, not toward me, not away. They walked perpendicular to the road straight toward the ocean side and stepped off the pavement into the fog. Just vanished. Gone. Like they'd walked through a doorway into nothing. I didn't wait. I put my foot down and drove past the spot where they'd been standing. My speedometer hit 60, then 65. I was flying blind through fog on a winding coastal highway, and I didn't care. I just needed to get out. And then, like flipping a switch, I burst out of the fog bank into clear night air. Stars overhead, moon reflecting off the ocean, road signs clearly visible in my headlights. I looked at the first sign I passed. Manzanita, 2 miles. I checked my odometer. I'd driven 87.6 miles since leaving Portland. I checked my fuel gauge, still 3/4 full. I checked my phone, 2:41 a.m., 24 minutes had passed since I'd first looked at my phone in the fog. I pulled over at the first turnout I found and just sat there, shaking for 20 minutes. I tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole thing. But I had the license plate number written on my hand. 847 KDL. I was wide awake now, adrenaline screaming through my system. I drove the rest of the way home at 30 miles per hour, checking my mirrors every 10 seconds. I got home at 3:30, ran inside, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I drove back to that stretch of highway in daylight. I found the abandoned truck exactly where I remembered it, 3 miles south of Cannon Beach. License plate 847 KDL. Same rust patterns, same missing tailgate. But according to my car's trip odometer, I'd only driven it past once. Physics says I couldn't have looped past the same physical object multiple times while continuously moving forward and increasing my odometer reading. That's impossible. But I did. I reported it to the Oregon State Police. The trooper was polite, but clearly thought I'd been driving exhausted and got disoriented in the fog. He suggested I'd maybe pulled over and dozed off without realizing it, dreamed the loop. I showed him the license plate number on my hand. He said that didn't prove anything except that I'd seen a truck. Fair enough. I contacted the highway department and asked if there was any construction or detours that night. Nothing. No road work, no closures, no reason for any kind of traffic pattern that would explain what I experienced. I've researched everything I can find about that section of Highway 101. Turns out there are stories. Not many, but they're there if you dig. People reporting strange experiences in the fog along that exact stretch, seeing figures in the road that disappear, feeling like they've driven the same section multiple times. Time distortions. One account from the 1970s describes almost exactly what happened to me. A driver who claimed to loop past the same gas station 4 times before the fog lifted, and they were suddenly 20 miles past where they thought they were. Local people call it the fog line. They say if you hit it at the wrong time, the road doesn't follow normal rules. I don't drive Highway 101 at night anymore. I take the long way, inland through the valley, even though it adds an hour to my trip, because I can't explain what happened to me that night, and that terrifies me more than any ghost story ever could. I'm an engineer. I understand how roads work, how physics works, how time works. But for maybe 90 minutes last February, none of those rules applied. I drove through something that shouldn't exist, and the only reason I got out is because something standing in that fog pointed me toward the exit. I don't know what that figure was. I don't know if it was trying to help me or trap me or warn me. I just know that somewhere between Cannon Beach and Manzanita, there's a section of Highway 101 that sometimes stops being a road and becomes something else entirely. And if you see fog that thick, that sudden, that wrong, turn around. Don't do what I did. Don't keep driving forward, thinking it'll clear, because you might end up driving forever, watching the same mile markers pass by again and again, burning no fuel and gaining no distance, trapped in a loop with no exit and no explanation. The fog doesn't follow rules, and neither does whatever lives inside it. I took the Winter Ranger posting at Cape Disappointment for the money. That's the honest truth. They were offering double pay for anyone willing to do a solo 3-month rotation from January through March, living in the old keeper's quarters attached to the lighthouse. Most people turned it down because winter on the Washington coast is brutal. Storms that'll knock you off your feet. Wind that screams through every crack in the walls. Isolation so complete you can go weeks without seeing another human being. But I was 26, broke from student loans, and figured I could handle anything for 12 weeks if it meant knocking out a chunk of debt. Cape Disappointment Lighthouse has been standing since 1856. It's the oldest operating lighthouse in the Pacific Northwest, perched on jagged rocks where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean. The area is called the Graveyard of the Pacific because over 2,000 ships have wrecked there. The water is violent, unpredictable, and during winter storms, the waves hit those cliffs with enough force to shake the ground. The lighthouse was automated decades ago, but the Park Service still keeps someone on site during winter to maintain the facility and monitor storm damage. That someone starting in January was me. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I expected. Cold, wet, windy, and lonely. I spent my days checking equipment, documenting erosion, clearing debris from the trails. My nights I spent in the keeper's quarters reading, watching movies on my laptop, and listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. The quarters were small but comfortable enough. 2 rooms, a kitchenette, a wood stove that I kept burning constantly. The walls were thick stone, built to withstand over a century of coastal storms. I felt safe there, even when the weather got so bad I couldn't see 20 feet past the windows. On my 15th day, I started some minor repairs in the storage room. There was water damage along the baseboards from a leak that had been patched but never properly finished. I pulled away some rotted wood paneling to assess how far the damage went, and that's when I found it. A journal. Leather-bound, water-stained, wedged into a gap between the stone wall and a wooden support beam. It had been deliberately hidden there, shoved deep into a space you'd never find unless you were tearing the wall apart. I pulled it out carefully. The leather was mildewed and cracked, but the pages inside were mostly legible. The first entry was dated November 3rd, 1952. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind of penmanship they don't teach anymore. It belonged to someone named Robert Kern, and according to the first few entries, he was the lighthouse keeper stationed there during the winter of 1952 and 1953. He wrote about routine things at first, weather observations, maintenance tasks, ships he spotted from the tower, supply deliveries. The mundane daily record of a man doing a job in isolation. But around the 20th entry, dated November 19th, the tone changed. He wrote, "The storm tonight is the worst I've seen in 3 years of lighthouse service. Waves are reaching the lantern room gallery, 80 feet above sea level. I thought I heard something on the exterior stairs during the worst of it, but when I checked with my lamp, nothing was there. Likely just debris thrown by the wind." I felt a small chill reading that. I'd been up in the lantern room during storms. The idea of something climbing those exterior stairs in hurricane-force winds was disturbing. The next entry, November 21st. It came again last night. Same sound. Methodical footsteps on the metal stairs, climbing from the rocks below. I went out this time with my pistol and spotlight. The storm was still raging, rain horizontal, wind strong enough to knock me against the railing. I shone the light down the stairs and saw nothing, but the footsteps continued above me, going higher. I followed them to the lantern room. The door was closed and locked from the inside, exactly as I'd left it. The sound stopped. I stood outside that door for 20 minutes in the freezing rain, listening. Nothing. When I finally unlocked it and went inside, the room was empty, but all the windows were covered in handprints from the outside. I stopped reading and looked up at my own walls. I should mention that the keeper's quarters, where I was staying, were directly attached to the lighthouse tower. The entrance to the spiral stairs that led up to the lantern room was literally 15 feet from where I slept. I could hear the wind moving through that stairwell every night, a constant low moan that echoed down from the top. I'd gotten used to it. Now, sitting there reading this journal by lamplight, that sound felt different. Intentional. I kept reading. November 24th. I haven't slept in 2 days. The footsteps come every night now, always during the worst part of the storm. Always climbing. Always stopping at the lantern room door. I've tried to photograph it, but my camera won't function properly in the weather. I've tried to ignore it, but the sound is impossible to dismiss. Last night, I heard scratching on the lantern room glass. Long, slow scrapes, like something dragging claws or nails across the panes. This morning, I climbed up to inspect. There are marks, deep gouges in the glass. On the outside, 80 feet above the rocks with no possible access point, except straight up the sheer cliff face or down from the sky. I've sent a radio message requesting early relief. I'm not staying here. November 28th. Relief has been delayed due to the storm. The ferry can't make the crossing. I'm trapped here for at least another week, possibly longer. The scratching is getting worse. Last night, it surrounded the entire lantern room, moving around the gallery in a slow circle. Whatever this is, it's testing the glass. I've covered all the windows from the inside with canvas tarps so I can't see out. I can't watch whatever is out there anymore. The sound alone is driving me to madness. During the day, I find marks on the rocks below, long scrapes in the stone like something massive has been dragging itself up from the water. November 30th. It's learning. Last night, the scratching changed rhythm. It found a weak point in one of the panes, a stress fracture I'd noted for repair but hadn't yet fixed. It's working on that spot specifically now, methodical, patient. I've reinforced it from the inside with boards, but I can hear the glass flexing with each scrape. The storm is supposed to break tomorrow. If I can just last one more night, relief should arrive by the weekend. December 2nd. 7th night, it broke through. That was the last entry. The page had water damage after that, the ink run and illegible, but I could make out a few scattered words on the following page. Lantern room compromised. Can't seal it from inside. Moving to lower quarters. And then nothing. The rest of the journal was blank, except for water stains and mildew. I sat there holding this journal, my hands shaking slightly. I pulled out my phone and searched for Robert Kern, Cape Disappointment lighthouse keeper. Nothing. I searched lighthouse keeper disappearances 1952 Washington. Nothing specific came up except the famous Flannan Isles case from Scotland. I checked historical records for Cape Disappointment. The lighthouse had been continuously staffed through the 1950s, but I couldn't find any mention of Robert Kern. It's like he never existed, or like his records had been scrubbed. I looked at the date. I'd been at Cape Disappointment for 15 days. A 5-day storm was forecasted to start tomorrow night. I was alone. The ferry wouldn't run in that kind of weather. I'd be trapped here for at least a week. I climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room slowly, journal still in my hand. The lantern room was exactly as it always was. Automated light rotating slowly. Windows clean and intact. No tarps, no boards, no scratches on the glass. I stepped out onto the exterior gallery, the metal catwalk that circles the lantern room 80 feet above the rocks. The wind immediately hit me, strong and cold. I looked down at the stairs leading to the rocks below, solid metal, zigzagging down the cliff face, slick with ocean spray. I checked every window carefully. Nothing. No marks. No damage. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. That night, the storm rolled in exactly as forecasted. By midnight, the wind was shaking the entire structure. Rain hammered the windows so hard it sounded like gravel. I lay in my bed in the keeper's quarters, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Footsteps on the exterior metal stairs, slow, steady, climbing. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The journal had been clear. It comes during storms. It climbs during storms. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window that faced the stairs. I couldn't see anything through the rain and darkness. The footsteps continued getting higher. I heard them reach the lantern room gallery. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Then the scratching started. Long, slow scrapes against glass. I ran up the spiral stairs, flashlight beam bouncing off stone walls. I burst into the lantern room and froze. All the windows were intact. But on the outside of every single pane, I could see the condensation from the rain being disturbed. Something was pressed against the glass. Multiple somethings. Large, moving slowly around the gallery in a circle. I stood in the center of the lantern room, rotating slowly, watching these massive shapes move past each window. I couldn't see what they were, just disturbances in the rain pattern, shadows darker than the night. Then one of them stopped directly in front of me. The scratching intensified on that pain. I stepped closer. Flashlight pointed at the window. The glass flexed inward slightly with each scrape. I could see the stress fractures beginning to form, tiny spiderweb cracks spreading from a single point. The same point Kern had described. The same weak spot. 70 years later, and it was still there, still being tested. I did exactly what Kern should have done. I ran. I went back down to the quarters, grabbed my emergency radio, and called the mainland. The dispatcher told me what I already knew. No ferry in this weather. Earliest extraction would be in 5 days when the storm broke. I told her something was trying to get into the lantern room. She asked if I was injured or in immediate danger. I said no. She told me to stay in the lower quarters and wait it out. Standard protocol. The lighthouse was built to withstand anything. I'd be fine. But I had Kern's journal. He'd thought the same thing, and he'd been wrong. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the keeper's quarters with every light on, listening to the scratching above me. It went on for hours. Around dawn, it stopped. When I climbed back up to check, the lantern room was empty. But the window with the stress fracture had new damage. The cracks had spread. Whatever was out there had made progress. I'm still at Cape Disappointment. I have 43 days left on my contract. The storm is on its 6th night now, and the scratching comes every evening like clockwork. The window is holding, but barely. I've reinforced it from the inside just like Kern did, but I can hear the glass flexing. I found something else today while searching the old maintenance logs. There's a notation from December 1952 about replacing all the lantern room windows due to structural damage from severe weather. No mention of a keeper named Robert Kern. No mention of what actually happened. Just a work order and a completion date. I think they know. I think the Park Service has always known that something comes to this lighthouse during winter, storms. Something that climbs from the rocks and tests the glass and waits for a weakness. That's why they offer double pay. That's why it's always a solo posting. That's why the rotations are only 3 months. They're gambling that the windows will hold and the keeper will last just long enough. Kern's journal said it broke through on the 7th night. Tonight is night 6. I've requested early relief. They told me the same thing they told him. The ferry can't run. I need to wait. I'm not going up to the lantern room tonight. I'm staying down here with the door barricaded. And tomorrow, if I'm still here, if nothing comes through the floor above me, I'm going to make a choice that Kern didn't get to make. I'm going to leave on foot, storm or no storm, and hike the 8 miles to the nearest ranger station. Because I read the last page of that journal one more time with a magnifying glass. Under the water damage, I could just barely make out the final sentence he wrote. It doesn't want the lighthouse. It wants the keeper. Whatever is scratching at that glass isn't trying to break in randomly. It's trying to reach whoever is inside. And tonight is the 7th night. The journal says that's when it learned how to break the glass. I'm about to find out if 70 years have taught it anything new. Photography saved my life once. Not metaphorically, not in some inspirational I found my purpose way. I mean, it literally kept me breathing. I'm a conservation photographer, which means I spend months documenting environmental restoration projects for nonprofits and government agencies. In September of last year, I was hired to photograph the salmon run along the Elwha River on Washington's Olympic Peninsula. The Elwha is famous because 2 massive dams were removed between 2011 and 2014, opening up 70 miles of river for the first time in over a century. Salmon populations were rebounding. It was an ecological success story, and I was there to capture it. The assignment was straightforward. 10 days, camping along different sections of the river, documenting the returning salmon, the restored habitat, the regeneration of the ecosystem. I'd done similar projects in Alaska, Montana, Oregon. This was routine work. I drove out to the Elwha in early September, timed perfectly with the peak of the fall Chinook run. The river was spectacular, crystal clear water rushing through restored channels, Gravel beds where salmon were spawning, eagles and bears feeding on the abundance. Everything the restoration advocates had promised was actually happening. On my fourth day, I hiked upstream to photograph an abandoned fish hatchery I'd spotted on an old topographic map. The hatchery wasn't part of my official assignment, but I'm drawn to decaying infrastructure. There's something haunting about facilities built with good intentions that are then left to rot. This particular hatchery dated back to the 1960s, built before the dams came down, and it had been decommissioned for at least 20 years. It sat about a mile off the main trail, accessible only by an overgrown service road that barely registered on GPS. I reached the site around noon. The hatchery was larger than I'd expected. Multiple concrete holding tanks the size of swimming pools, rusted metal buildings with collapsed roofs, a maze of old piping and water channels that once diverted river flow through the facility. Everything was overgrown with blackberry brambles and alder saplings. The whole place had that eerie stillness you get in abandoned industrial sites, like the machinery is just sleeping and might start up again at any moment. I started photographing the main holding tanks. They were arranged in a grid pattern, 12 tanks total, each one about 30 feet across and maybe 8 feet deep. Most were empty except for rainwater and decaying leaves. But as I moved through the facility, I noticed something odd in one of the far tanks. Personal items. A backpack sitting at the bottom, still relatively clean. I walked to the edge and looked down. The backpack was bright blue, modern, definitely not 20 years old. Next to it was a water bottle, a hiking pole, and what looked like a rain jacket. My first thought was that someone had accidentally dropped their gear while exploring the site, but the items were arranged too deliberately. The backpack was upright, zipped closed. The jacket was laid out flat, like someone had carefully placed it there. I moved to the next tank. More items. A pair of hiking boots, laces still tied, positioned side by side. A baseball cap. A smartphone in a waterproof case. I felt my stomach tighten. These weren't dropped items. These were left items, deliberately placed at the bottom of empty concrete tanks. I photographed everything from above, zooming in with my telephoto lens. 7 of the 12 tanks contained personal belongings. All of it looked recent, nothing weathered or degraded like it had been there for years. In one tank, I saw a small day pack with a hospital bracelet still attached to the strap. In another, a fleece pullover with a brewery logo from Port Angeles. These were real people's things. Belongings from hikers, probably from people who'd come to see the restored Elwha, just like me. I pulled out my phone to call the ranger station. No signal. I was too deep in the drainage, surrounded by steep terrain. I'd have to hike back to the main trail to get reception. But something stopped me from leaving immediately. Photographer's instinct. I needed to document this properly before I reported it. Evidence. I needed clear photos showing exactly what was in each tank, the layout of the facility, the context of the scene. I spent the next 20 minutes systematically photographing each tank, taking wide shots and detail shots, making sure my camera's GPS was tagging every image with location data. That's when I noticed the water channels. The hatchery had been built with an elaborate system to divert river water through the facility. Large concrete channels, maybe 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, ran between the tanks like hallways. They were designed so water could flow from the river, through the holding tanks, and back out to the river downstream. But the system had been shut off decades ago. The channels were dry, filled with moss and small saplings. Except they weren't all dry. I walked along one of the channels and saw fresh water marks. Recent flow. The concrete was wet, and there were small pools of standing water in the low spots. I followed the channel toward the river and found the control gate. It was a massive steel sluice gate designed to regulate water flow into the facility. It should have been rusted shut, immobile, after 20 years of disuse. Instead, it was open. Not all the way, but open enough to allow water to flow through, and the hinges had fresh grease on them. Someone had maintained this gate. Someone was still using this system. I felt the fear hit me then, cold and sharp. This wasn't an abandoned facility. Someone was actively using it. Using it for what? The holding tanks could trap people if water was diverted into them. The channels could funnel someone from the river, intake all the way into the facility with no escape. I thought about the items in the tanks, not scattered randomly like someone had fallen in. Arranged, organized, like someone had removed them from the people who'd been wearing them. I needed to leave immediately. I turned back toward the service road and stopped. Fresh tire tracks. I hadn't noticed them on my way in because I'd been focused on the facility, but now I saw them clearly. Vehicle tracks, recent enough that the tread pattern was still sharp in the mud. Someone had driven here in the last few days. Someone with access to the service road that wasn't on any official map. I started walking fast, then jogging. The service road curved through dense forest for almost a mile before it connected to the main hiking trail. My camera bag bounced against my back. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a vehicle coming up behind me. The forest felt different now. Too quiet. The wrong kind of quiet. I thought about salmon hatcheries, how they're designed to concentrate fish in controlled environments, how the holding tanks are basically traps, how easy it would be to use that same infrastructure to trap something else. Halfway back to the main trail, I heard an engine, distant but getting closer, coming from behind me from the direction of the hatchery. I looked around frantically. The forest on both sides of the service road was thick with undergrowth, nearly impenetrable. I couldn't go off trail without making a ton of noise crashing through the brush. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The road curved ahead, and I pushed myself harder than I've ever run with 40 pounds of camera gear on my back. The engine noise grew louder. Definitely a truck, diesel, moving slowly but steadily up the service road. I came around a bend and saw the junction with the main trail, maybe 200 yards ahead. I sprinted. My lungs were burning. My camera bag was slamming against my spine with every step. I didn't care. I hit the main trail and kept running, putting distance between myself and that service road. I didn't stop until I reached a section of trail where I had cell service. I was gasping, hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I called the Clallam County Sheriff and reported everything. The belongings in the tanks, the operational water system, the vehicle tracks, the truck I'd heard. The dispatcher took me seriously, told me to get to the ranger station and wait there. Don't go back to my campsite. Don't go anywhere alone. Just get to the ranger station. 2 sheriff's deputies met me there an hour later. I showed them the photos on my camera. They saw what I'd seen. Personal items in the holding tanks. Recent items. They called for backup and drove out to the hatchery with a search and rescue team. I stayed at the ranger station giving a formal statement to a detective who'd driven up from Port Angeles. He asked me detailed questions about exactly where everything was located, what time I'd been there, whether I'd touched anything. I told him I hadn't gone down into the tanks. Everything I'd seen was from above. The search team was at the hatchery for 2 days. They recovered items from 7 of the holding tanks. Personal belongings linked to 5 missing persons cases spanning the last 3 years. All of them had been hiking in the Olympic National Forest during salmon season. All of them had simply vanished, with no trace found during the initial searches. The detective told me that the hatchery's water diversion system could be used to trap someone in the holding tanks. Once water starts flowing in, the tanks fill fast. The walls are smooth concrete. No way to climb out. If someone controlled that sluice gate, they could drown anyone they'd lured or forced into the facility. They never found bodies. The water channels emptied back into the Elwha downstream. During salmon runs, the river is full of bears, eagles, scavengers. Evidence wouldn't last long. They did find the truck I'd heard. It belonged to a man who owned property adjacent to the national forest, someone with legal access to old logging roads that connected to the service road. When they went to question him, his house was empty. He'd cleared out. Gone. They found maps in his garage with the hatchery marked, along with GPS coordinates for campsites along the river. My campsite was one of them. The detective told me that if I hadn't photographed the holding tanks when I did, if I'd just reported vague suspicions without visual evidence, they might not have responded so quickly. The photos proved something was wrong. They showed a pattern, and my camera's GPS data gave them exact coordinates for a crime scene that wasn't on any official map. Photography had documented evidence that saved the investigation. But more than that, my instinct to stop and photograph instead of immediately running probably saved my life. If I'd left the moment I saw the first backpack, I would have been on that service road when the truck arrived. Instead, I was deep in the facility, hidden by the concrete structures, while whoever was driving went somewhere else first. I never finished that assignment. I packed up my gear and drove home that same day. The Elwha River is beautiful. The salmon restoration is one of the most successful environmental projects in American history, but there are still places along that river that aren't safe. Old infrastructure from the dam era, abandoned facilities that were supposed to be decommissioned and forgotten. Someone found a use for them. Someone who understood how to weaponize a system designed to concentrate and control fish populations. The man they're looking for is still out there. The last update I got from the detective was 3 months ago. No arrests, no sightings, just a warning. If I ever go back to photograph the Olympic Peninsula, stay on marked trails, don't explore abandoned structures, and if I ever see personal belongings, arranged in a place where they shouldn't be, don't stop to photograph them. Just run. I bought my house outside Enumclaw, Washington, in March of last year because it was the only thing I could afford. Single-story farmhouse conversion, 1,200 square feet sitting on 2 acres of overgrown land. The listing said it needed work, which was realtor code for borderline uninhabitable, but the price was $50,000 below everything else in King County. I'm a graphic designer, work from home, just needed space and quiet. The house came with both, maybe too much of both. The property had a neighbor, technically, another house about 300 yards away, through a line of Douglas firs, but that house had been abandoned for years. Boarded windows, collapsing porch, driveway so overgrown, you could barely tell where it used to be. The realtor told me the previous owner had died, and the family couldn't sell it because of some estate dispute. It had been sitting empty since 2019. I walked over there once during my first week, just being nosy. The whole place had that haunted house vibe. Peeling paint, rotten wood, blackberry vines swallowing the foundation. I didn't go inside, just looked through a gap in the boards and saw empty rooms filled with trash and animal droppings. I spent my first month settling in and doing basic renovations. New paint, fixed leaky faucets, replaced some rotted floorboards. The house was livable, just outdated. It had this weird layout where all the rooms were on a raised foundation with a crawlspace underneath instead of a basement. The crawlspace access was a hatch in the laundry room floor, maybe 2 feet square, with a rusty padlock on it. The inspector's report said the crawlspace was structurally sound, but filthy. Recommended I seal it off better to keep rodents out. I put it on my to-do list and forgot about it. Things started getting weird in my second month. Small things at first. I'd come back from grocery shopping and find cabinet doors open that I knew I'd closed. A chair pulled away from the dining table. My laptop moved from the desk to the couch. I blamed it on stress and working too much. Maybe I was more distracted than I realized. Then items started disappearing. A coffee mug I'd just used, my favorite hoodie, a phone charger. I tore the house apart looking for them, never found any of it. In June, I started smelling cigarette smoke. I don't smoke, never have. But several times a week, usually in the evening, I'd catch the distinct smell of tobacco smoke drifting through the house. It was strongest in the hallway near the laundry room. I checked every room thinking maybe the smell was coming from outside, drifting through a window. All the windows were closed. The smell was coming from inside, from below. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself the previous owner had been a heavy smoker, and the smell was just embedded in the walls, released when the temperature changed. That explanation worked until I started hearing sounds, shuffling noises under the floorboards, not rats or raccoons. This was deliberate movement, something large shifting position in the crawl space. I'd be sitting at my desk working and hear it directly beneath me. A long, slow dragging sound, like someone pulling themselves across the ground. One night in late June, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breathing. Not my breathing, someone else's. Slow, measured breaths coming from somewhere in my bedroom. I lay there, frozen, listening. The sound was coming from the heating vent near the floor. I turned on my bedside lamp, and the breathing stopped immediately. Dead silence. I got up and shone my phone flashlight into the vent. Just darkness and the faint smell of cigarette smoke. That's when I decided to check the crawl space. I should have called someone, a friend or the police, but honestly, I felt stupid. What was I going to say? I heard breathing in my vent. They'd think I was paranoid or having a breakdown. I waited until morning, gathered my courage, and went to the laundry room. The padlock on the crawlspace hatch was still in place, but when I examined it closely, I realized it wasn't actually locked. Someone had cut through the shackle and placed it back so it looked secure from a distance. My hands were shaking as I removed the fake padlock and lifted the hatch. The smell hit me immediately. Cigarette smoke, body odor, and something else. The sour smell of someone living in an enclosed space without ventilation. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it down into the crawl space. The beam illuminated about 3 feet of clearance between the ground and the floor joists. Bare earth, old insulation hanging from the beams, spider webs everywhere. And then I saw the tunnel. Someone had dug a passage through the dirt floor, leading away from my house toward the direction of the abandoned property next door. The tunnel was maybe 2 feet wide, reinforced with scrap wood, and it disappeared into darkness. Next to the opening were clear signs of habitation: a camping mattress, empty food containers, water bottles, a flashlight, cigarette butts scattered everywhere, and photos. Polaroid photos tacked to the wooden floor joists. Photos of me, sleeping in my bed, sitting at my desk, cooking in the kitchen, dozens of them, taken from low angles through the floor vents. I dropped the hatch and ran. Didn't grab my keys, didn't grab my phone, just ran straight out the front door to my car. I drove to the Enumclaw Police Department and told them everything. 2 officers came back with me immediately. They went into the crawl space with proper equipment and lights. What they found was worse than I'd imagined. The tunnel connected my crawl space to the abandoned house next door. Someone had been living in the shared space between both properties, accessing both houses at will. In my crawl space, they found the photos, the camping setup, and a detailed journal. The journal documented everything: what time I woke up, what I ate for breakfast, what I watched on TV, my work schedule, when I left the house, and when I returned. Entries going back almost 2 months. Whoever this was had been watching me since late April, less than a month after I moved in. They'd been entering my house while I was asleep or away, going through my things, taking items, rearranging furniture. The journal even described which floor vents had the best views into my bedroom and bathroom. The officers searched the abandoned house next door. The crawlspace entrance on that side was hidden behind a collapsed section of flooring in what used to be the kitchen. The house itself showed signs of recent occupation. Someone had been living there, using the derelict structure as a base while they watched me. They found more evidence: my missing hoodie, my coffee mug, other personal items that had disappeared from my house. They also found evidence this person had been watching the property for longer than I'd lived there. Photos of the previous owner, notes about delivery schedules and visitors. The detective who took over the case told me this was classic stalker behavior escalating into a home invasion scenario. The person likely became obsessed with the property or the previous owner. And when I moved in, I became the new focus. The fact that they'd maintained access through the shared crawlspace meant they'd been planning this for years, probably since before the neighboring house was abandoned. They'd created the tunnel system, knowing it would give them access to whoever lived in my house. They never caught him. The crawlspace was empty when police arrived. All the personal items and journal were still there, but whoever had been living in that space had disappeared. The detective said they'd likely been watching when I drove to the police station and had fled during that window. They put out alerts, searched the surrounding area, interviewed neighbors. No one had seen anything unusual. The few neighbors on our rural road didn't even realize someone had been living in the abandoned house. The police installed motion sensors in both crawl spaces and sealed the tunnel with concrete. They recommended I install a security system, change all my locks, and consider moving. I told them I'd just bought this house. I couldn't afford to move. They stationed a patrol car outside for 3 nights, then told me they couldn't justify the resources anymore without an active threat. I was on my own. I lasted 2 more weeks in that house. 2 weeks of sleeping with every light on, a bat next to my bed, and pepper spray on my nightstand. 2 weeks of jumping at every sound, checking the crawlspace hatch obsessively, installing cameras in every room. The cameras showed nothing. The motion sensors never triggered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. That whoever had been down there was just waiting for me to let my guard down. The breaking point came when I was reviewing footage from my bedroom camera and noticed something in the corner of one frame. The heating vent cover was slightly askew, like someone had removed it and put it back incorrectly. This was after the tunnel had been sealed, after the police had searched everything. I checked the vent immediately. Behind the cover, I found fresh scratches in the metal ductwork. Someone had been trying to remove the vent from inside the crawlspace. Recently, the concrete seal was still intact, but there were other access points. The ductwork itself could be crawled through if someone was small and determined enough. I left that night, packed a bag, got in my car, and drove to my sister's place in Seattle. I put the house up for sale the next morning. Took a massive loss because I had to disclose everything that had happened. The property sat on the market for 8 months before someone finally bought it. A developer who planned to tear down both houses and build new construction. I hope they did. I hope they ripped out every floor joist and filled in every crawl space and burned everything they pulled out of the ground. The detective called me 3 months ago with an update. They'd identified a suspect based on DNA evidence from cigarette butts in the crawl space. A man who'd done maintenance work on the property in 2018, before the previous owner died. He'd been arrested in Spokane on an unrelated breaking and entering charge. When they searched his storage unit, they found journals documenting over a dozen properties he'd been watching. Houses with shared crawl spaces, or connected basements, or tunneled foundations. Places where he could move between structures without being detected. My house was just one of many. He's in custody now, awaiting trial, but the detective told me something that still keeps me awake at night. The journals showed he'd been doing this for over 15 years, watching people, living in their walls, collecting their belongings. And in all that time, across all those houses, only 3 people had ever discovered him. I was the 3rd. The detective asked me what I thought happened to the others who never found him. The ones who lived their entire lives in those houses, never knowing someone was inches below them, watching through vents, listening through floors, documenting their every move. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. I live in a 3rd-floor apartment now, concrete building, no crawl space, no basement, no shared walls with abandoned structures. I still check my vents obsessively. I still wake up at 3 in the morning listening for breathing that isn't mine. Because the worst part isn't what happened. The worst part is knowing how long it went on before I noticed. 2 months. He watched me for 2 months before I even suspected anything was wrong. How many nights did he lie in my crawl space while I slept 10 feet above him? How many times did he enter my house and stand in my room while I was unconscious and vulnerable? I'll never know. And that's the part I can't forget. Not knowing is worse than knowing, because your imagination fills in the gaps with things far worse than reality. Or maybe reality was actually worse, and I just never discovered all of it. Either way, I can't go back. I can't ever feel safe in a house with a crawlspace again. And if you live in one, if you have that little hatch in your laundry room or basement that you never check, maybe you should. Maybe you should check it tonight, because someone might already be down there, waiting for you to go to sleep so they can watch you through the vents. And you'll never know unless you look. My girlfriend Emma and I made a mistake in October. A simple mistake that people make every day. We trusted our GPS over common sense, and it nearly cost us everything. We were driving from Seattle to Portland for a wedding, and Emma suggested we take the scenic route through the Cascades instead of boring Interstate 5. She'd found this route on some travel blog that promised stunning fall colors and hidden viewpoints. The GPS showed it would only add 90 minutes to the trip. We had time. Why not make an adventure of it? The route started off exactly as advertised. Beautiful 2-lane highway winding through forest, ablaze with October gold and red. We stopped at a few pullouts, took photos. Felt like we'd discovered something special that most tourists miss. Then around mile 40, the GPS told us to turn left onto Forest Service Road 4219. Emma hesitated. The road wasn't marked with any signage, just a gap in the trees and a gravel surface disappearing into dense forest. But the GPS was insistent. This route would save us 20 minutes compared to staying on the highway. I was driving. I made the call. We turned onto the Forest Service Road. The gravel was rough but manageable in Emma's Jeep. We figured it was maintained for ranger access or logging operations. The first 2 miles were fine. Trees pressed close on both sides, but the road was clear. Then we came around a curve and saw the sign. Faded orange letters on weathered plywood. Road closed. Do not enter. The sign had been knocked over, lying flat in the brush beside the road. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Emma said we should turn around. I looked at the GPS. It showed this road continuing for another 8 miles before reconnecting with a paved highway on the other side of the ridge. We'd already come 2 miles. Turning around meant backtracking and losing time we didn't have. The wedding started in 4 hours. I convinced Emma the sign was probably old, left over from winter road closures. It was October. The road was clearly passable. We kept going. That was our second mistake. The road got worse. Deeper ruts, larger rocks, sections where washouts had nearly eroded the entire surface. We were committed now, though. The forest was too dense to turn around safely. We had to keep pushing forward to find a wide spot. After another mile, the road opened into a clearing. An old logging cut, maybe 30 years abandoned. Stumps overgrown with moss. Second-growth alders filling in the gaps. And in the center of the clearing, arranged in a way that made my skin crawl, were piles of clothing. Not scattered, not dumped carelessly. Arranged, 7 distinct piles, each one positioned in a rough circle, maybe 50 feet across. Emma saw them the same moment I did. I stopped the Jeep. We sat there staring through the windshield, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Each pile contained clothes, shoes, backpacks, personal items. All of it arranged like someone had carefully laid out the contents of a person's pack and then stepped away. The clothing was positioned as if bodies were still wearing it. Shirts spread flat with arms extended, pants with the legs straight, shoes still laced, positioned at the end of the pant legs. Emma's voice was shaking when she said, "We need to leave right now." I agreed completely. But when I tried to back up, the Jeep lurched and stopped. The rear end had dropped. I got out to check. We'd high-centered on a stump hidden in the tall grass. The rear differential was hung up on rotted wood, rear wheels suspended about 3 inches off the ground. We were stuck, completely stuck in a clearing full of what looked like crime scene evidence, 8 miles from the nearest paved road. I grabbed the jack from the back. Emma was already on her phone trying to call for help. No signal. We were in a deep drainage between ridges. No cell coverage. She tried 911 anyway. Nothing. I started jacking up the Jeep while Emma walked the perimeter of the clearing, staying well away from the clothing piles. She was documenting everything with her phone camera. Photos and video, evidence. Her hands were shaking so badly the footage was barely usable. That's when we heard the engine. Diesel. Heavy vehicle. Coming from the direction we'd driven, back down the Forest Service road. The sound echoed through the trees, getting steadily louder. Someone was coming. Someone was driving up this closed, unmapped, abandoned logging road toward the clearing where we were trapped. Emma ran back to the Jeep. I was still trying to jack it up, hands fumbling with the equipment. The engine noise got closer, maybe half a mile out. Emma made a decision. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the tree line. We hide, right now. Leave everything. I wanted to argue. Wanted to keep working on the Jeep, but the fear in her voice cut through my panic. We ran to the edge of the clearing and pushed into the dense undergrowth. Salal bushes, sword ferns, fallen logs. We crawled maybe 30 yards into the forest and pressed ourselves flat behind a massive, rotting log. From there, we had a partial view of the clearing, and our Jeep sitting there with the jack still under it. The vehicle that entered the clearing was a Ford F-250, dark green, mud-caked, at least 15 years old. It pulled in slowly and stopped about 50 feet from our Jeep. The driver stayed inside for maybe 2 minutes, just sitting there, engine idling, looking at our vehicle. Then the door opened and a man got out. Mid-40s, heavy build, wearing canvas work clothes and boots. He walked around our Jeep slowly, looking at the license plate, peering through the windows. He saw the jack. He saw our situation. Then he looked at the clothing piles. Here's the thing that made my blood freeze. He didn't react with surprise or confusion. He looked at those piles like he was checking inventory. He walked to the nearest pile, the one with a blue backpack and hiking boots, and adjusted the position of the boots slightly, straightened them, like he was maintaining a display. Then he pulled out a phone and made a call. We were too far away to hear the conversation, but it lasted maybe 30 seconds. When he hung up, he walked back to his truck and pulled out a toolbox. Emma's fingernails were digging into my arm. We both understood what we were watching. This man was connected to whatever happened here. Those clothing piles weren't random. They were trophies, or markers, or evidence of something terrible. And we'd driven right into the middle of it. The man walked to one of the empty spaces in the circle and set down the toolbox. He opened it and pulled out stakes and orange flagging tape. He was marking a spot. An 8th spot in the circle. A spot that didn't have clothing yet. The sound of another vehicle made him stop and look toward the road. Another diesel engine, heavier than the first. A second truck was coming. The man walked back to his F-250 and leaned against it, waiting. A Dodge Ram, older and more beat up than the first truck, pulled into the clearing. Another man got out. Older, maybe 60, same type of work clothes. They spoke briefly, too quietly for us to hear. Then both of them looked at our Jeep. The older man walked to it, reached through the open driver's window, and popped the hood. They were disabling our vehicle, making sure we couldn't leave even if we got it unstuck. Emma and I were lying in the ferns, watching 2 men methodically trap us in this clearing. The older man pulled something from the engine bay, wires, or a component I couldn't identify from our distance, and tossed it into the back of his truck. Then both men stood there talking, occasionally looking at the tree line, looking in our general direction. I don't know if they could see us, but they knew we had to be nearby. People don't leave their vehicle stuck with the jack out and just vanish. The younger man went back to his truck and pulled out a rifle, not pointing it at anything, just carrying it casually. The message was clear. They were prepared for whoever owned that Jeep to be in the woods watching. They were ready. The older man walked to the far side of the clearing and started searching the tree line, looking for tracks or disturbed vegetation, signs of where we'd entered the forest. Emma whispered in my ear, barely audible. We moved deeper. Now, Quietly, we started crawling backward, away from the clearing, trying to move silently through the undergrowth. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot to me. Every rustled fern felt like a beacon. We crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably 10 minutes, putting distance between ourselves and the clearing. When we were maybe 100 yards out, we stopped and listened. Voices, distant. The men were in the forest now, searching. We could hear them moving through the brush, calling to each other. They weren't being subtle. They were making noise deliberately, trying to flush us out. Emma pulled out her phone. Still no signal, but she started typing a note in her phone's memo app. Names, dates, descriptions of the men and their vehicles, GPS coordinates of the clearing, everything we'd seen. Evidence. If something happened to us, if our phones were ever found, there would be a record. We kept moving, parallel to the ridge, trying to gain elevation where we might get cell signal. The terrain was brutal. Fallen logs every 20 feet, dense undergrowth, steep slopes. We could hear the men behind us still searching, but the sounds were getting fainter. We were moving faster than they could search systematically. After maybe an hour of climbing, Emma's phone chirped. 1 bar of signal. She immediately dialed 911. The call connected, but the signal was terrible, cutting in and out. Emma spoke as clearly as she could, giving our approximate location, describing the clearing, the men, the clothing. The dispatcher kept asking her to repeat information. The signal dropped twice, and Emma had to call back. Finally, the dispatcher confirmed they had enough information and were sending sheriff's deputies and search and rescue. Stay on the line. Stay where you are. Help is coming. We waited on that ridge for 3 hours. We could see our jeep far below in the clearing. The 2 trucks were still there. The men had returned to their vehicles and were just waiting. Waiting for us to come back. Waiting for darkness. Waiting for something. Around 4 o'clock, we heard sirens in the distance. The sound echoed strangely through the mountains, but it was definitely coming closer. The men in the clearing heard it too. They had a brief conversation. Then both trucks started up and drove out of the clearing, back down the Forest Service road. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's SUVs entered the clearing from the opposite direction, from the paved highway side of the Forest Service road. We started making our way down the ridge toward them, calling out so they'd know we were coming. When we finally reached the clearing, there were 4 deputies waiting. They'd seen the clothing piles. They'd photographed everything. One of them was on the radio calling for detectives and crime scene investigators. The lead deputy told us we'd stumbled onto an active investigation. The clearing had been discovered 6 months earlier by a Forest Service survey crew. The clothing and personal items matched descriptions from 7 missing persons cases dating back 3 years. All of them had been hiking or camping in the Cascade Mountain region. All had vanished without trace. The Forest Service had closed the road and set up cameras, hoping whoever was responsible would return. But the cameras had been disabled or stolen. This was the first time anyone had actually witnessed someone at the site. Our descriptions of the men and vehicles gave investigators their first solid leads. License plate partial from Emma's photos. Detailed physical descriptions. Confirmation that this was an active dumping site being maintained by at least 2 individuals. The deputy also told us something that made me sick. The 8th spot the younger man had been marking. That was probably meant for us. We'd driven into their hunting ground, and they decided we were the next addition to their collection. They recovered our Jeep with a tow truck. The engine component the older man had removed was critical. We couldn't have driven out even if we'd gotten unstuck. They'd made sure of that. The detectives found fresh tire tracks leading to a gate on private property that bordered the national forest. Legal access to the logging road from a side route that wasn't monitored. A property owner with knowledge of the old road system and the authority to use it without raising suspicion. I don't know if they ever caught the men. The detective said it was an ongoing investigation and couldn't share details. That was 11 months ago. Emma and I didn't make it to the wedding. We spent 6 hours giving statements and another 2 hours at a hospital getting checked for shock. We don't drive Forest Service roads anymore. We don't trust GPS routes that take us off main highways. And we don't ignore road closure signs, no matter how old or knocked over they appear. Because somewhere in the Cascades there are people using abandoned logging infrastructure to hunt. And the Forest Service road system has thousands of miles of unmapped, unmonitored access points, places where you can disappear and become nothing more than a pile of clothes in a clearing, arranged like a trophy and maintained like a garden, waiting for the next person who makes the same mistake we did and trusts technology over instinct. My two best friends, Tyler and Melissa, got me into mushroom foraging 3 years ago. We're not professional mycologists or anything like that, just enthusiasts who learned from guidebooks and experienced foragers. We've done dozens of trips throughout Washington and Oregon, and we know what we're doing. We can identify chanterelles, morels, lobsters, hedgehogs. We know what's toxic. We know death caps, destroying angels, deadly galena. We've never made a mistake, never gotten sick, never had a close call, which is why what happened in Gifford-Pinchot National Forest last November still doesn't make sense to any of us. We drove down from Tacoma on a Saturday morning in mid-November, peak chanterelle season. The forest had gotten good rain the previous week, perfect conditions for a big flush. We had our permits, our baskets, our field guides. We hiked into a section of the forest we'd been to maybe 5 times before, an area around 2,000 feet elevation where the golden chanterelles grow thick under the Douglas firs and hemlocks. Beautiful territory. Dense canopy, soft forest floor covered in fir needles and moss. Quiet except for the sound of wind in the trees and ravens calling overhead. We started finding chanterelles within the first 100 yards. Big, beautiful specimens, bright orange-gold fruiting bodies pushing up through the duff. We spread out about 50 feet apart, moving parallel through the forest, each of us harvesting our own spots and calling out when we found a particularly good cluster. Tyler was to my left, Melissa to my right. Perfect weather, perfect mushrooms, perfect day. For the first 2 hours, everything was exactly as it should be. Around 11 o'clock, I noticed something unusual. A large cluster of chanterelles growing in what looked like a perfect spiral pattern. Not scattered naturally like they usually grow, but arranged in a deliberate curve. Maybe 30 individual mushrooms forming an arc about 6 feet across. I called Tyler over to look. He took photos with his phone, said he'd never seen a growth pattern like that. Melissa came over too. We all agreed it was weird, but not alarming. Mushroom colonies can form strange patterns based on underground mycelium networks. We harvested the outer edge of the spiral and kept moving. 20 minutes later, Melissa found another spiral. This one was even more distinct. The mushrooms formed a complete circle, maybe 8 feet in diameter. And in the center of the circle was a cluster of mushrooms we didn't recognize. Dark caps, almost black, with gills that had a purple tint. None of us had seen that species before. Melissa checked her field guide. Nothing matched. I pulled up a mushroom identification app on my phone. No cell signal this deep in the forest, so the app couldn't access its database. Tyler suggested we photograph them and identify them later. We didn't harvest the unknown species, just took pictures and marked the location on GPS. That's when I realized we'd been walking in a curve. I checked my compass. We'd been moving roughly northeast for the past hour, but somehow we were now facing south. The terrain hadn't changed. No landmarks had indicated we'd turned, but we'd looped around without meaning to. Tyler checked his GPS. According to the coordinates, we were about 400 yards from where we'd started, but it felt like we'd covered at least a mile. Melissa said she felt strange, lightheaded. I asked if she'd eaten anything. She said no, but her vision was doing something weird. Colors seemed brighter. The trees looked like they were swaying, even though there was no wind. Tyler admitted he felt it too. A kind of dreamy disconnection, like everything was slightly unreal. I didn't feel anything yet, but I was starting to get concerned. We decided to head back to the car. I pulled out my GPS and selected the waypoint for our parking spot. Distance showed 0.9 miles, almost directly west. We started walking, following the GPS bearing. Within 10 minutes, I started feeling what Melissa and Tyler had described. Everything looked oversaturated. The green of the moss seemed impossibly vivid. The tree trunks had patterns in the bark that seemed to move and shift when I looked at them. Melissa stopped walking. She was staring at her hands. "I can see the blood moving under my skin," she said. Her voice sounded distant, hollow. Tyler was looking up at the canopy. "The trees are breathing," he said. I knew then we were experiencing hallucinations, but none of us had eaten anything. We'd been careful. We only harvested chanterelles, and we knew chanterelles. They're not toxic. They don't cause hallucinations. I checked my basket. All golden chanterelles, nothing else. Tyler and Melissa's baskets were the same. I checked the GPS again. We'd been walking west for 10 minutes, but the distance to our car now showed 1.2 miles. We were moving in the right direction, but the waypoint was getting farther away. That didn't make sense, unless we were walking the wrong direction and I was reading the compass wrong. I looked at the compass again. The needle was spinning slowly, rotating through all 4 cardinal directions in a smooth circle. That wasn't possible. Compasses don't do that unless there's massive magnetic interference. Tyler sat down on a log. "I need to rest. Everything's spinning." Melissa was turning in slow circles, looking at the forest around us. "We've been here before," she said. "I recognize that tree. We passed it 20 minutes ago." I looked at the tree she was pointing at. A massive, old-growth Douglas fir, maybe 6 feet in diameter, with a distinctive burled trunk. I didn't remember seeing it before, but I also couldn't be sure. Everything looked simultaneously familiar and alien. I made a decision. We needed to stay together and keep moving in one direction, regardless of what the GPS said. I picked a bearing due west, based on where the sun should be, even though I couldn't actually see the sun through the canopy. We started walking again. Tyler was stumbling. Melissa kept stopping to look at things that weren't there. I was fighting my own perceptions, trying to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. The trees seemed to be closing in. The forest felt denser than it had been. We came to a clearing, small, maybe 20 feet across, and there in the center was another spiral of mushrooms. The same dark species we'd seen before, arranged in a perfect whirl. But this spiral was bigger, maybe 15 feet across, and the mushrooms in the center were enormous, caps the size of dinner plates. Tyler walked toward them. I grabbed his arm. "Don't touch them," I said. He looked at me with dilated pupils. "They're beautiful," he said. "They're singing." I couldn't hear any singing, but I could feel something. A low vibration in my chest, like standing next to a large speaker playing bass notes below the range of hearing. Melissa was at the edge of the clearing, looking back the way we'd come. "There are more," she said. I turned and saw what she was seeing. The trail we just walked was lined with the dark mushrooms. They formed a path leading back into the forest. I didn't remember walking past them, but they were there now. Or they'd always been there, and we hadn't noticed. I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what my brain was inventing. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal, but I opened the voice recorder app and started documenting. Timestamp, our symptoms, the location, everything I could observe. Speaking helped me focus. I described the mushroom spirals, the hallucinations, the compass malfunction, the GPS showing impossible distances. Tyler and Melissa were both sitting on the ground now. Tyler was crying. Melissa was laughing at something I couldn't see. I was the only one still functional, and I could feel myself slipping. I remembered something from a mushroom safety course I'd taken. Some species release spores that can be psychoactive if inhaled in high concentrations. Not psilocybin mushrooms, but other fungi that produce mycotoxins that affect the nervous system. and we'd been walking through clusters of these unknown dark mushrooms for at least an hour. We'd been breathing spore clouds the entire time. We were poisoned, not from eating mushrooms, but from inhaling them. That realization cut through the fog in my head. I got Tyler and Melissa to their feet. "We're poisoned," I told them. "Spore poisoning. We need to get to lower elevation and fresh air." The words seemed to anchor them slightly. Melissa nodded. Tyler wiped his face. We started moving again, and this time I didn't trust the GPS or compass. I looked for water. Streams in this area run downhill toward the west, eventually draining into the Cowlitz River. If we followed water, we'd reach lower elevation and eventually hit a road. We found a small creek and followed it downhill. The mushroom spirals were everywhere now. Every 20 yards, another pattern, the dark species growing in perfect geometric arrangements. I tried not to look at them, tried to focus on the water, the sound of it moving over rocks, real, tangible. But the hallucinations were getting worse. I saw faces in the tree bark, heard voices calling my name from deeper in the forest, felt like something was following us just outside my peripheral vision. Time became meaningless. We might have walked for 30 minutes or 3 hours, but eventually the forest started to thin. The canopy opened up, and suddenly we were at a road, Forest Service Road 25, recognizable from the signs. We sat on the shoulder and waited. My phone showed we'd been in the forest for 7 hours. It felt like both 20 minutes and 20 days. A pickup truck stopped. The driver asked if we needed help. We looked like hell, muddy, disoriented, pupils dilated. He drove us to the ranger station at Randall. The ranger called for medical transport. We were evaluated at the hospital in Morton. Blood work showed elevated levels of certain enzymes consistent with mycotoxin exposure. The doctor said we were lucky. Whatever we'd inhaled hadn't caused permanent damage, but another few hours of exposure could have resulted in seizures or worse. They kept us overnight for observation. By morning, the hallucinations had mostly stopped, though colors still seemed off, and I kept having moments of déjà vu. A mycologist from the University of Washington came to interview us 3 days later. We showed him the photos we'd taken of the dark mushrooms. He went pale, asked us to describe exactly where we'd found them. We showed him the GPS coordinates from before the compass went haywire. He told us those mushrooms shouldn't exist in Washington. The species in the photos matched a rare fungus documented in Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, known for producing spores that cause severe neurological symptoms, including hallucinations, time distortion, and spatial disorientation. There's no established population in North America, except apparently now there is, in Gifford, Pinchot National Forest. The mycologist asked if we'd noticed the growth patterns. The spirals. We told him yes, perfect geometric spirals. He said that's not natural. That species doesn't grow in patterns like that. Something was deliberately cultivating them, arranging them. He wouldn't speculate on what or who, but he said the Forest Service needed to close that area and do a full survey. The concentration of spores in those spiral formations could incapacitate or kill anyone who walked through them. We never got our mushroom baskets back. They were taken for analysis. 40 pounds of beautiful golden chanterelles, all contaminated with spores from the dark species. Everything had to be destroyed. The Forest Service did close a section of the forest, citing hazardous biological material. That was 8 months ago. The closure is still in effect. I've tried to find updates on what they found, but there's been no official statement. Just a vague notice about ongoing environmental remediation. Tyler doesn't forage anymore. Says he can't trust his perceptions in the forest. Melissa still goes out, but never to Gifford Pinchot, and never alone. I've been once since then, to a different area, heavily trafficked trails only, but I can't shake the memory of those spirals. The perfect geometric patterns. The dark mushrooms arranged like they were marking territory or creating barriers. and the feeling that something in that forest wanted us to keep walking in circles until we couldn't walk anymore, until we became part of the pattern. Mushroom foraging is safe if you know what you're doing. We knew what we were doing, and it almost killed us anyway, because sometimes the danger isn't what you eat, it's what you breathe, and you can't avoid breathing. I've been an amateur radio astronomer for 12 years. That probably sounds more impressive than it is. I'm not a professional scientist, just a guy with a homemade radio telescope in my garage and an obsession with listening to the universe. I built my array from salvaged satellite dishes and open-source software. It's not powerful enough to discover new pulsars or map distant galaxies, but it can detect radio emissions from Jupiter, track solar flares, and occasionally pick up deep space signals that make my equipment go haywire in interesting ways. Most nights, I'm just recording static and noise. But that's the beauty of it. You're listening to the universe breathe. In January, I drove out to the Oregon High Desert near Heart Mountain National Antelope Refuge for a week of observation. The refuge is one of the darkest places in the continental United States. No light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. The kind of sky where you can see the Milky Way so clearly it looks like someone spilled milk across the black. Perfect conditions for both optical and radio astronomy. I'd been planning this trip for months, timing it with the new moon and the quadrantid meteor shower. I had my telescope, my radio array, my laptop, and enough supplies to camp alone for 7 days. I set up camp about 15 miles into the refuge on a plateau with clear views in all directions. During the day, the landscape is stunning. High desert sage, rimrock cliffs, pronghorn antelope moving across the flats. At night, it transforms into something otherworldly. The silence is absolute. No traffic, no aircraft, no human sound at all. Just wind and occasionally the distant cry of a coyote. The first 3 nights were perfect. I photographed meteors, recorded emissions from the Orion Nebula, tracked Jupiter's radio bursts, standard amateur astronomy. Beautiful, meditative, exactly what I'd hoped for. On the 4th night, January 11th, my radio telescope picked up something unusual. A signal. Not cosmic background radiation or stellar noise. This was structured. Repeating. It came through around 11 p.m., a burst of radio energy lasting about 8 seconds, then silence for exactly 90 seconds, then another burst. Same duration, same frequency range. The signal was centered around 785 megahertz, which is odd because that's not a natural frequency you'd expect from astronomical sources. It's more in line with terrestrial broadcast frequencies, but there's nothing out here to broadcast. I checked my equipment. No malfunction. The signal was real, and my directional antenna was pointed 35 degrees above the horizon northeast. I used my software to triangulate the source. The program calculated the signal was originating from approximately 40 miles above ground level and descending. That didn't make sense. 40 miles up is roughly the boundary between the stratosphere and mesosphere. Not space, but too high for aircraft. And the signal was getting stronger with each repetition, which meant whatever was transmitting was getting closer. I recorded everything. Raw data, audio conversion, timestamps. The signal continued for 20 minutes, 18 bursts total, each one slightly louder than the last. Then it stopped. Complete silence. I waited for an hour, antenna still pointed at the calculated trajectory. Nothing. I played back the audio conversion, the radio signal translated into sound waves my ears could process. It sounded like rhythmic pulses, almost mechanical. But underneath the pulses there was something else. A modulation pattern that my software flagged as potentially containing information. I ran the signal through a basic decoding program, trying different protocols. AM, FM, digital, analog. Most of it came back as garbage, but one section, about 4 seconds from the 7th burst, decoded into something recognizable. A voice, human voice, speaking a language I didn't understand. I isolated that section and played it repeatedly. The voice was male, speaking what sounded like individual words separated by pauses, short phrases. I uploaded the audio to a language identification app on my laptop. It took 15 minutes to process with my weak satellite internet connection. The app identified the language as Ichishkeen, a dialect spoken by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. Not extinct, but not widely spoken outside the reservation communities in Oregon. I don't speak it. The app provided a rough translation. They're returning. Go dark. Silence everything. The translation repeated 3 times in the 4-second clip. Same words, same voice, like a warning being broadcast. I sat in my camp chair, staring at my laptop screen, trying to process this. Someone or something was transmitting a warning in an indigenous language from 40 miles above the Oregon desert. The rational part of my brain said it had to be some kind of atmospheric reflection of a terrestrial broadcast, maybe from a tribal radio station bouncing off the ionosphere. But my equipment doesn't pick up reflected signals. It's designed to filter out terrestrial interference. This signal came from above, descending, and getting closer with each pulse. I should have packed up and left right then, driven back to civilization and reported what I'd found to someone qualified to analyze it. But I'm an astronomer. My entire hobby is about investigating signals from space. I wasn't going to run from the most interesting thing I'd ever detected. I reconfigured my antenna array and pointed it back at the coordinates where the signal had originated. I waited. Midnight passed, 1 a.m. Nothing. The desert around me was completely dark except for starlight and the glow from my laptop. At 1:47 a.m., the signal came back. Same frequency, same pattern, but much stronger. My equipment registered it as coming from approximately 15 miles above ground level. Still descending, the bursts were now 60 seconds apart instead of 90. Faster. More urgent. I recorded everything again and ran another decoding pass. This time the translation was clearer. 7 minutes. Don't let them see you. Extinguish all light. 7 minutes until what? Don't let who see me. I looked at my camp, my laptop screen glowing white in the darkness, my headlamp hanging on a hook inside my tent, turned off but visible. My truck parked 30 feet away, with reflective windows. From above, my camp would stand out like a beacon against the black desert. I didn't know if I believed the warning was meant for me, but something in my gut said I should listen. I shut down my laptop, covered my truck with a dark tarp, killed every light source I had, and sat in complete darkness. The signal continued, now repeating every 30 seconds. My equipment was still recording, even though I couldn't see the screen. I sat there in the absolute black of the high desert, listening to the wind and counting seconds in my head. After about 4 minutes, I noticed something. The stars were disappearing. Not from clouds. The night was clear, but a section of sky directly above me, maybe 30 degrees of arc, was going dark. Like something massive was blocking the starlight. Something between me and space. I couldn't see details, just an absence of stars where stars should be. The dark shape was descending. I could tell because the area of blocked starlight was growing larger, expanding as whatever it was came closer to the ground. I pressed myself flat against the sage, making myself as small and invisible as possible. The wind stopped. Complete silence. Even the coyotes had gone quiet. The temperature dropped suddenly, maybe 10 degrees in 30 seconds. My breath fogged in front of my face. Something passed overhead. I never saw what it was, just felt it. A massive presence moving through the air maybe 200 feet above me. No sound, no lights, no visible structure, just this overwhelming sense of scale, like a mountain floating through the night sky. The blocked stars moved across my field of vision from northeast to southwest, tracking the same trajectory my equipment had calculated for the descending signal. It took maybe 90 seconds for the shape to pass completely overhead. Then the stars came back. Temperature normalized. Wind resumed. I lay there in the sage for another 20 minutes, not moving, barely breathing. The signal had stopped. My equipment was silent. Eventually, I risked turning on my laptop just long enough to check the recording. The data was there. Signal strength had peaked at 1:53 a.m. and then cut off abruptly. The audio in those final moments before silence showed the warning message had changed one last time. They didn't see you. Remain still until dawn. They circle back. I stayed motionless until the eastern horizon started to gray with pre-dawn light. When I finally stood up and looked around, the desert was exactly as it had been. My equipment was undisturbed. My truck was fine. There was no physical evidence that anything unusual had happened. Except when I checked the data logs from my radio telescope, I found something impossible. During the 90 seconds when the shape had passed overhead, my equipment had recorded electromagnetic radiation levels consistent with exposure to a massive magnetic field. The readings were similar to what you'd see standing next to an MRI machine or a particle accelerator. That kind of field should have fried my electronics. Instead, everything worked perfectly. I packed up my camp in less than an hour and drove straight back to Bend. I reported the incident to the Federal Aviation Administration, thinking maybe I'd witnessed some kind of classified military aircraft. They took my statement and said they'd investigate. I never heard back. I contacted the Warm Springs Tribal radio station and asked if they'd broadcast anything unusual on January 11th. They said no and asked why I was asking. I didn't tell them. I've analyzed the recordings hundreds of times. The signal is real. The language translation is accurate. The magnetic field readings are undeniable. Whatever passed over my camp that night was massive, silent, and technologically sophisticated enough to broadcast warnings in a language specific to the indigenous people of that region. And it didn't want to be seen. The warning wasn't for everyone in the area. It was specific, targeted. Like something knew I was there and was giving me a chance to hide. I've tried to research historical accounts from the Confederated Tribes about aerial phenomena or unexplained events in that region. Most of what I've found is restricted or considered sacred knowledge not meant for outsiders. But I did find one reference in a published oral history from the 1970s. An elder described the silent ones who return when the stars align, and said that seeing them directly was forbidden. Those who looked upon them were said to vanish or return changed, unable to speak of what they'd seen. I haven't been back to Heart Mountain. I still do radio astronomy, but only from my garage in town. I monitor that same frequency range sometimes, 785 megahertz, wondering if the signal will return. So far, nothing. But I've noticed something in my data logs that I can't explain. On the 11th of every month since January, at exactly 1:47 a.m., my equipment registers a brief spike in electromagnetic activity. It lasts less than a second, too short to triangulate a source, but it's there, regular, repeating, like something is checking in, making sure I'm still listening, still remembering. I don't know what I witnessed that night in the high desert. I don't know if it was experimental aircraft, extraterrestrial surveillance, or something else entirely, but I know the warning was real. I know something massive and invisible can move through our skies without leaving a trace, and I know that whatever it is, it circles back. The message said so. They circle back, and next time I might not get a warning in time to hide. I've been a ski patrol at Mount Baker for 8 years. I've seen broken bones, hypothermia, dislocations, concussions, every kind of injury you can imagine on a mountain. I've participated in dozens of rescues, pulled people out of tree wells, stabilized spines, administered oxygen to altitude-sick climbers. I thought I'd seen everything winter could throw at human beings. Then February 14th happened, and I realized there are things worse than death on a mountain. There are things that look like survival, but aren't. It was a Tuesday, mid-February, and we'd just gotten hammered with 4 feet of new snow over 3 days. The avalanche danger was rated extreme. We'd closed all the backcountry access gates and posted warnings everywhere. No one was supposed to be out there. My partner Carlos and I were doing enforcement patrol, skiing the boundary lines to make sure no one ducked the ropes. Mount Baker backcountry is no joke. Steep terrain, hidden crevasses, cornices that can collapse without warning. In those conditions, going out there was suicide. Around noon, we got a radio call from base. Someone had reported seeing 4 people skinning up into the closed zone about 2 hours earlier. They'd ignored the warnings and gone anyway. Carlos and I looked at each other with that tired frustration every patroller knows. People think they're invincible. They think avalanche ratings don't apply to them. We grabbed our rescue packs and headed out to find them and drag them back before they killed themselves. We tracked their skin track for about a mile, climbing steadily into increasingly dangerous terrain. The snow was wind-loaded, sitting on a weak layer we'd identified in our morning pit tests. Prime slab avalanche conditions. We were moving carefully, testing every slope before committing. Then we heard it. The sound every backcountry skier dreads. A deep whoomph, like the mountain exhaling. The slope above us had released. We didn't see the avalanche coming. We heard it, felt the ground shift, and then we were diving for cover behind a rock outcrop. The slide roared past us maybe 50 yards upslope, a river of white chaos moving faster than a car. Thousands of tons of snow thundering downhill, obliterating everything in its path. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then silence. That terrible post-avalanche silence where you're checking yourself to make sure you're still alive and whole. Carlos was already on the radio calling it in. Major avalanche, Crown Street sector, approximately 4 people potentially caught. We needed backup, search dogs, and a helicopter if one could fly in this weather. Then we started the search. Standard protocol. Transceivers out, searching for beacon signals. We were scanning the debris field when Carlos got a hit. Strong signal close, maybe 30 feet down the slope, buried under 6 feet of settled snow. We started digging, shoveling as fast as we could, racing against the 15-minute window before brain damage from oxygen deprivation becomes likely. We found the first person at 12 minutes, male, mid-30s, completely buried. We cleared his airway, checked for breathing. He was alive. Unconscious, but alive. We got him into a rescue position and kept digging because his beacon was still transmitting, which meant there were more people down there. We found the second person 8 feet from the first. Female, late 20s, also buried deep. Also alive but unconscious. Then the third, male, younger, maybe 25, alive, unconscious. And the fourth, all of them unconscious. All of them breathing. All of them buried for at least 40 minutes based on when they'd entered the backcountry. That should have been impossible. Survival rates after 40 minutes of complete burial are almost zero. No air pocket, no breathing space, just packed avalanche debris that sets like concrete. You suffocate. That's what happens. But these 4 were breathing. The helicopter arrived and we loaded them for transport. I rode with them to the hospital in Bellingham. During the flight, something happened that I still can't explain. All 4 of them opened their eyes simultaneously, not gradually waking up, all at once like someone had flipped a switch. Their eyes were open but wrong, unfocused, staring at nothing, and they were moving in perfect synchronization. When one turned their head left, they all turned left. When one's hand twitched, all their hands twitched. Identical movements, simultaneous. The flight medic noticed it too. He asked them questions. No response. He checked their vitals. Heart rates were identical. 72 beats per minute across all 4 patients. Respiration rates matched. Blood pressure matched. 4 different people with 4 different bodies, showing identical vital signs down to the individual heartbeat. The medic looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Fear. Pure fear. At the hospital, things got worse. The The 4 patients were taken to the ER and examined. Physically, they were fine. Mild hypothermia, some bruising, but no major injuries. No brain damage, no frostbite. Nothing that explained 40-plus minutes of burial without oxygen. The doctors couldn't explain it. One of them said it was medically impossible. Human beings don't survive that long without air. But they had. And they were awake now, sitting up in their beds, still moving in eerie synchronization. I stayed at the hospital because something felt deeply wrong. I watched through the window as nurses tried to communicate with them. The 4 patients would speak, but they spoke in unison. Same words, same inflection, same timing, not finishing each other's sentences, speaking the same sentence simultaneously. The nurses were backing away. One of them called for a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist arrived and tried to evaluate them. She asked simple questions. What's your name? Where are you? What day is it? They answered in perfect unison. 4 voices speaking as one. But the answers were wrong. When asked their names, they all said the same name. When asked where they were, they said under. When asked what day it was, they said the 7th night. That phrase, the 7th night. They repeated it over and over. We survived the 7th night. We need to go back. We need to go back under. The hospital put them in isolation and called the county health department. There was talk of infectious disease, environmental contamination, something in the snow. I gave my statement to the hospital administrator, and then I left because I needed to get back to the mountain. But I couldn't stop thinking about what they'd said. The 7th night. We need to go back under. It sounded like they were talking about something other than the avalanche. I did some research when I got home. Checked incident reports, avalanche databases, historical records for Mount Baker. Nothing matched what I'd witnessed. But I found something else. A notation in the patrol logs from 1997. 4 backcountry skiers caught in an avalanche in the same area. All 4 survived despite extended burial. All 4 exhibited unusual behavioral synchronization after rescue. The report was flagged for follow-up, but there was no follow-up documentation. Just a note that said subjects released themselves from hospital care against medical advice and were not located for further evaluation. I went back to the hospital the next morning. The 4 patients were gone. They'd walked out sometime during the night. Security footage showed all 4 of them standing up from their beds at exactly 3 a.m., walking to the exit in perfect lockstep and leaving the building. No coats, no shoes, hospital gowns, walking out into 20-degree weather. Security tried to stop them, but they didn't respond to verbal commands. They just kept walking. Out the door, across the parking lot, into the forest. Search and rescue was called. Dogs tracked them for about 2 miles heading uphill, back toward the mountain, back toward the avalanche zone. The trail ended at the debris field where we dug them out. The dogs indicated they'd stop there. But there were no footprints in the snow beyond that point. No tracks leading away. The 4 people had reached the avalanche debris and vanished. We searched for 3 days. Helicopters, ground teams, dogs, infrared, nothing. 4 people in hospital gowns couldn't survive in the backcountry in February. They should have frozen within hours. But we never found bodies. Never found clothing. Never found any sign they'd been there, except for the dog tracking evidence and the security footage showing them walk away. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead from exposure. But I know something else happened. I've been back to that avalanche site a dozen times. There's something wrong with the snow there. It's denser than it should be, harder, and when you dig into it, even now, months later, it's cold in a way that doesn't match air temperature. Cold that goes deeper than weather. Cold that feels intentional. I talked to an old-timer who's been patrolling Baker since the 70s. Told him everything I'd seen. He went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You found the ones who went back." I asked what he meant. He said there's a phenomenon on Baker that patrol doesn't talk about. Every few years, someone gets buried in an avalanche in that specific zone and survives impossibly long. And when they're dug out, they're changed. They can't integrate back into normal life. They feel compelled to return to the snow. Most of them do, eventually. They go back to the place they were buried and they dig themselves back in. Deliberately. And they're never found. I asked him why. Why would anyone do that? He said he didn't know, but there were theories. Old theories from indigenous people who lived around Baker for thousands of years. Stories about spirits that live in the deep snow, entities that preserve things, that keep things in stasis. And sometimes when people are buried long enough, when they cross from the edge of death into something beyond, those entities offer a choice. Stay in the frozen dark, where time doesn't pass and pain doesn't exist, or return to the world where everything hurts and everyone dies. Some people choose the snow. I don't know if I believe that, but I know what I saw. 4 people who survived something that should have killed them. 4 people who came back wrong. 4 people who chose to return to the place that buried them. And I know that the avalanche debris in that zone never fully melts, even in summer. There's always a remnant, always a patch of old snow that persists year after year, getting denser and harder and colder. And sometimes, when I'm patrolling that area alone, I can hear sounds coming from under the snow. Breathing. Multiple people breathing in perfect synchronization. Slow. Patient. Waiting for the next person to cross the boundary and trigger the slide that will take them down and offer them the same choice. Stay under where it's quiet and timeless, or claw your way back to the surface where nothing lasts. I don't go to that zone anymore. And when skiers ask me why it stays closed even in stable conditions, I tell them it's protocol. Avalanche protocol. But the real reason is simpler. Some snow doesn't want to let go of what it's buried. And some things that get dug out should have stayed down there in the dark, where they were preserved and perfect and forever frozen on the 7th night. Graduate school is supposed to be the best years of your life if you love your field. I loved marine biology more than anything. I'd spent 6 years studying Pacific coastal ecosystems, published 3 papers on intertidal zone biodiversity, and I was 3 months away from defending my dissertation. My research focused on predator-prey dynamics in Oregon tide pools, specifically how purple sea stars and ochre stars interact with mussel populations during different tidal cycles. Unglamorous work. Lots of time crouched on wet rocks counting invertebrates. But it was mine, and I was good at it. Cape Perpetua was my primary research site. I'd been working there for 2 years, documenting the same tide pool systems through multiple seasons. I knew every rock formation, every pool, every resident starfish and anemone. The site manager knew me by name and let me access restricted areas for sampling. I had permits, I had protocols, I had years of safe fieldwork under my belt. I'd done this particular collection routine maybe 50 times. There was no reason April 8th should have been any different. The tide charts showed optimal low tide at 6 p.m., which meant I needed to be on site by 5 to set up my quadrats and begin systematic counts before the pool's fully exposed. Spring tides are the best for research because they reveal zones that are usually underwater. I parked at the Cape Perpetua lot, grabbed my collection kit and waterproof field notebook, and hiked down to my study area. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, light wind, ocean, relatively calm. Textbook conditions. I started my work in the upper intertidal zone and worked my way down toward the lower zones as the tide receded. Standard procedure. Count organisms in each quadrat, record environmental conditions, take water samples, photograph any unusual specimens. By 5:45, I was in the mid-intertidal working through Pool 7 of my designated 12 pools. That's when I noticed something I'd never seen before. A cluster of organisms I couldn't immediately identify. They were in the deepest part of Pool 7, partially obscured by kelp. At first, I thought they might be some kind of tunicate or sea cucumber, but the texture was wrong, too smooth, too uniform. And they were moving in a way that didn't match any invertebrate I knew. not the slow glide of a nudibranch or the pulsing of an anemone. This was deliberate, coordinated. I pulled out my underwater camera and photographed them from multiple angles. When I reviewed the photos on my camera's display, I felt a chill despite my wetsuit. The organisms had what looked like articulated segments, almost like fingers or tendrils, and they were positioned as if they were grasping the rock substrate. But the disturbing part was the color. They were flesh-toned, not the pale, translucent flesh of deep-sea creatures, but the pink tan of human skin. I'd never seen anything like them in 2 years of intensive study at this exact location. I checked my watch, 5:52. The tide was still dropping. I had maybe 90 minutes of optimal working time before it would start coming back in. I needed to collect a specimen for proper identification back at the lab. I pulled out a collection jar and reached into the pool with my gloved hand. The moment I touched one of the organisms, all of them moved. Fast. Faster than anything that size should be able to move underwater. They scattered to different parts of the pool, and some disappeared into crevices in the rock. I managed to grab one and get it into the jar. It writhed against the glass with unsettling strength. Up close, the resemblance to human tissue was even more pronounced. The texture, the color, even what looked like pores in the surface. I sealed the jar and made a note to priority process it when I got back. Then I noticed the water level. It should have been dropping steadily. Instead, it was rising. Small waves were already washing back into Pool 7, and I could hear the ocean getting louder. I checked the tide chart on my phone. Low tide wasn't for another 8 minutes. The water shouldn't be coming in yet. But it was. Fast. I looked toward the ocean and saw something that made my stomach drop. The waves were much larger than they'd been 20 minutes ago. Dark swells rolling in, building as they approached the rocks. And the channels between the tide pools, the routes I'd used to access the lower intertidal zone, were already flooding. I started moving immediately, heading back toward higher ground. But the water was coming in faster than it should, faster than any tide chart predicted. I was scrambling over slick rocks, trying to reach the upper zone before I got cut off. That's when I slipped. My boot caught on a patch of kelp, and I went down hard, landing on my side in shallow water. The collection jar flew from my hand, shattered on the rocks. The organism I'd captured washed away instantly. I got back to my feet, but now I had a problem. The main route back to shore was already underwater. Waves were crashing into the channels, sending spray 15 feet into the air. I was on a small rock outcrop, maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by surging water. The tide had come in at least 30 minutes earlier than it should have, and it was still rising. I pulled out my phone to call for help. No signal. Cape Perpetua has spotty coverage in the best conditions, and down in the tide pool zone, I had nothing. I looked for alternative routes. There was a cliff face behind me, maybe 12 feet high, leading back to the main coastal trail. Normally, I'd never attempt to free climb wet basalt, but I didn't have a choice. The water was already washing over my boots. In another 10 minutes, my outcrop would be completely submerged. I started climbing, finding handholds in the rough rock, testing each grip before committing my weight. I was about 8 feet up when I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down. The water below me was now 3 feet deep and rising, and there was something moving in it. Multiple somethings. Dark shapes, too large to be fish, circling the base of the cliff. I climbed faster, ignoring the burn in my forearms, focusing only on the next handhold. I was almost to the top when my right hand slipped. I caught myself with my left, scrabbling for purchase, legs dangling. That's when something grabbed my ankle, not grabbed like a current or kelp. Grabbed with pressure, with intent, with what felt unmistakably like fingers. I looked down and saw it. An arm, or something that looked enough like an arm to make my rational brain completely shut down. It was the same flesh-tone color as the organisms I'd found in Pool 7, but this was much larger, human-sized, and there were more of them rising from the water, reaching toward the cliff. I kicked hard, Adrenaline overriding everything else, my boot connected with something solid, and the grip released. I pulled myself up the remaining 4 feet and rolled onto the coastal trail, gasping, shaking, unable to process what I'd just seen. I crawled away from the edge and finally stood up, looking back down at the tide pools. The water was churning white with waves, and I couldn't see anything beneath the surface anymore. Just ocean reclaiming the intertidal zone like it did twice a day, every day, forever. I ran back to my car and drove straight to the Cape Perpetua Visitor Center. I tried to explain what happened to the ranger on duty. I showed him my field notes, my photographs of the organisms in Pool 7. He looked at the photos and frowned, asked if I felt all right, asked if I'd hit my head when I slipped. I insisted I was fine, that something had grabbed me in the water, that there were organisms in those pools that shouldn't exist. He made me sit down and drink water while he called for a Park Service biologist. The biologist arrived 40 minutes later. She reviewed my photos and my notes. She told me the organisms in Pool 7 looked like they might be some kind of colonial tunicate, possibly a species not previously documented in that specific location, but not unheard of. The warming ocean was bringing new species into the Pacific Northwest all the time. As for something grabbing my ankle, she suggested it was likely kelp or debris in the surge, that the human brain is wired to interpret ambiguous stimuli as familiar shapes when we're scared. She was kind but firm. I'd had a frightening experience, but there was a rational explanation. I wanted to believe her. I tried to believe her. But I've spent 6 years studying marine biology. I know kelp. I know debris. I know how things move underwater. What grabbed my ankle had joints, had strength, had intention. I've reviewed my photographs 100 times. The organisms in Pool 7 don't match any tunicate species in any database I've accessed. And there's one detail I didn't mention to the ranger or the biologist. One detail I noticed only when I got home and examined my boot. There are marks on the leather, indentations, 4 parallel grooves on each side of the ankle, positioned exactly where fingers would grip if something was trying to pull me down. The grooves are deep, deeper than kelp could create. And inside those grooves, embedded in the leather, are traces of organic material. I sent a sample to a lab colleague for analysis. She called me 3 days later with results that made no sense. The material contains human DNA, but it's wrong. The genetic markers are human, but the sequence has anomalies, duplications and deletions that shouldn't exist in viable tissue. I haven't been back to Cape Perpetua. I submitted a request to change my dissertation research site to a different location. My advisor approved it without question, which made me wonder if he'd heard something. If other researchers had experienced something similar and never reported it. I've done some digging through old marine biology journals and incident reports. There are scattered references. A researcher in 1983 who claimed to find impossibly complex organisms in the same tide pool zone and was laughed out of his position. A student in 1997 who nearly drowned in a freak tide surge at Cape Perpetua and dropped out of the program entirely. A visiting scientist in 2011 who reported seeing human-like forms in the water during a storm and was never taken seriously again. The Pacific Ocean is the largest ecosystem on Earth. We've explored less than 5% of it. New species are discovered constantly. Deep-sea vents, abyssal zones, trenches that have been isolated for millions of years. All of them contain life that evolved completely separately from what we see on land. But the intertidal zone isn't deep ocean. It's the boundary between our world and theirs. It's where things cross over twice a day, revealed, and then hidden again by the tides. I think about Pool 7 sometimes, about what I saw there, about the fact that those organisms appeared in a pool I'd studied intensively for 2 years without ever seeing them before, like they'd migrated up from somewhere deeper, like they were testing the boundary, seeing how far they could come into our zone before someone noticed. And when I did notice, when I tried to take one, they responded. They followed me. They tried to pull me back down, The tide charts for April 8th were accurate. I checked them against no AA records. Low tide occurred exactly when predicted at 6:03 p.m., which means the water that came flooding back in 30 minutes early wasn't the tide. It was something else, something that pushed a wall of ocean into that zone ahead of schedule, specifically to cut off my escape. And the things in that water were waiting for exactly that to happen. They knew the timing. They knew the terrain. They knew I'd be trapped. I'm finishing my dissertation using archived data from other sites. I'll defend it remotely if I have to. But I'm done with fieldwork in the intertidal zone. Done crouching over tide pools at low tide, exposed and vulnerable, while the ocean decides whether to let me leave. Because the ocean isn't neutral. It's not just water following gravity and lunar cycles. There's intelligence in there. Ancient intelligence that's learned to mimic what it sees. Learned to create things that look almost human enough to be disturbing, but not quite human enough to be believed. And it's waiting in the pools at Cape Perpetua for the next graduate student who stays just a little too long past low tide. For the next researcher who gets curious about organisms that shouldn't exist and reaches into the water to collect them. For someone who doesn't run fast enough when the water comes back in. The tide pools reveal secrets twice a day, but some secrets are meant to stay hidden, and some things that look like discoveries are actually invitations to become part of the ecosystem yourself, permanently. Down where the water never recedes and the pressure never stops, and something that learned your shape is still wearing it like a glove. I became a hospice nurse because I wanted to help people during the most important transition of their lives. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth is, I took a traveling hospice contract in a small Washington town because I needed to disappear for a while. Bad breakup. Terrible breakup, actually. The kind where you need to put 500 miles between you and someone who won't accept that it's over. The agency offered me a 6-week assignment in a place called Dryad, population 237, tucked into the Willapa Hills, where the rain never really stops. Perfect, remote, anonymous, exactly what I needed. I drove into Dryad on a Sunday afternoon in late November. The town was exactly what you'd expect from a dying timber community. One main street with a handful of businesses, most of them closed. A combination gas station and grocery store. A diner that looked like it hadn't updated its menu since 1987. Houses scattered along muddy roads disappearing into the forest. The whole place had that heavy, wet silence you only get in the Pacific Northwest when the rain is constant and the trees absorb every sound. The hospice facility was a converted motel on the edge of town. 6 patient rooms, a small office, a supply closet, and me. I'd be the only nurse on site during the overnight shifts, with a day nurse covering mornings and a rotating on-call doctor from the nearest hospital 40 miles away. The orientation was brief. The patients were all elderly, all local, all in various stages of decline. Standard end-of-life care. I'd done this work in 3 other states. I knew the routine. My first week was unremarkable. I learned the patients' names and conditions, administered medications, documented vital signs, sat with families during those long, quiet hours when there's nothing to do but wait. The patients were kind. The families were grateful. And slowly I started to notice something odd. During conversation, multiple patients would reference the same event. A mill fire that killed 40 workers back in 1952. They'd bring it up unprompted, describing it in identical detail. The smell of burning wood and flesh, the sound of men screaming, the way the whole town turned out to help fight the flames. I thought it was just a significant historical event that had shaped the community. Small towns remember their tragedies. But when I had downtime, I looked it up. I searched newspaper archives, historical records, Washington State industrial accident databases. There was no record of a mill fire in Dryad in 1952. No record of any fire killing 40 workers. No mention of a mill even operating in Dryad that year. The town's primary employer had been a logging camp, and it had closed in 1948. I asked the day nurse about it. She looked at me strangely and said, "Of course there was a fire." She remembered hearing about it from her grandmother, who'd lost a brother in the flames. I showed her the research I'd done. She stared at the screen, frowning, and then said, "I must be looking in the wrong archives." The fire happened. Everyone knew it happened. Her certainty was unsettling. Over the next 2 weeks, more patients referenced the fire, not just in passing, but in detail. One woman described watching from her bedroom window as a child, seeing the flames light up the night sky. Except she was born in 1957, 5 years after the supposed fire. When I pointed this out gently, she became agitated, insisted she remembered it clearly, could see it in her mind. The orange glow, the ash falling like snow. She started crying, saying I was trying to take her memories away. That's when I started having the dreams. Vivid, detailed dreams set in Dryad decades before I was born. In the dreams, I was working at the mill. I knew the layout of the building, the names of my coworkers, the routine of the shifts. I could smell the sawdust and machine oil, feel the vibration of the saws. In the dreams, I had a life here, a history, relationships, and daily routines that felt completely real. I'd wake up disoriented, unable to shake the feeling that I'd actually lived those moments. One night, I dreamed about the fire. I was in the mill when it started, saw the sparks catch in a pile of dry shavings, watched the flames spread faster than anyone could react, felt the heat and the panic. In the dream, I tried to help people escape, but the smoke was too thick. I woke up gasping, my heart racing, the smell of smoke still in my nostrils even though my room was clear. The dream felt like a memory. Not something imagined, but something recalled. I started documenting everything. The patients who mentioned the fire, the details they provided, the inconsistencies with historical records. I also started documenting my own experiences, the dreams that felt too real. The moments during my shifts when I'd have sudden flashes of familiarity with places I'd never been, like walking past a house and knowing the interior layout, or seeing an elderly patient and remembering them as young, even though I'd never met them before in my life. The breaking point came during my 4th week. I was sitting with a patient named Dorothy who was actively dying. Her breathing was labored, her consciousness fading. I was holding her hand, providing comfort in those final hours. She opened her eyes, looked directly at me, and said my name. Not the name I use now, but another name. A name I'd never heard before, but that felt intimately familiar the moment she said it. She said, "I'm glad you came back. We've missed you since the fire." Then she closed her eyes and stopped breathing. I sat there for 20 minutes trying to process what had happened. Dorothy had called me by a name that felt like mine, but wasn't. She'd implied I'd been part of this community before, that I'd been here during an event that never happened. I checked her chart. She had advanced dementia. The logical explanation was that she'd confused me with someone from her past. But that didn't explain why the name felt right. Why hearing it made something shift in my chest like recognition. I tried to leave town the next morning, packed my things, got in my car, drove to the main road, but I couldn't remember where I was going. I sat at the intersection for 15 minutes trying to recall why I'd wanted to leave. What was I running from? I couldn't remember the breakup that had brought me here. Couldn't remember my life before Dryad. All I could remember was the mill, the fire, the life I'd had here in 1952. A life that wasn't mine but felt more real than anything else. I drove back to the hospice facility. The day nurse was there. She smiled at me and said, "Couldn't leave, could you? Nobody leaves Dryad once the town remembers them." I asked her what she meant. She said the town has a memory, a collective memory that absorbs people who stay too long. The rain carries it, sinking into your skin, into your thoughts. The town had experienced so much loss over the decades, So many people dying when the timber industry collapsed, so many forgotten. The memories needed somewhere to go. They needed people to hold them. She told me about others who'd come to work at the hospice, traveling nurses, visiting doctors, social workers. Most lasted 2 or 3 weeks before the memories started. Some left early. Some stayed and became part of the collective. She'd been here for 18 years. Couldn't remember anymore if she'd been born here or arrived from somewhere else. The memories of Dryad had replaced her original history. She lived a dozen overlapping lives now, all of them connected to this place, this rain, this dying town that refused to be forgotten. I should have been terrified. I should have fought it. But the memories were comforting. In them, I had community. I had purpose. I had a place where I belonged so completely that my individual identity didn't matter. The hospice patients weren't strangers anymore. They were people I'd known for decades. The mill fire wasn't a historical inconsistency. It was a shared trauma that bound us together. Even though it never happened, we'd all experienced it. We all carried it. That made it real. I'm still in Dryad. My 6-week contract ended 3 months ago, but I didn't leave. I couldn't explain why to the agency, so I just stopped responding to their calls. Eventually, they stopped calling. I live in a small apartment above the diner now. I work overnight shifts at the hospice. During the day, I walk through town and remember things that happened before I was born. I remember working at the mill, raising children in houses that were torn down decades ago, attending church socials at a building that burned in the 70s. None of it is my history, but all of it is my memory. The rain never stops in Dryad. It soaks into everything, into the buildings, the roads, the people, and it carries memory, collective memory of a town that's been dying for 70 years but refuses to disappear completely. We hold it together, those of us who stayed. We remember for the ones who are gone. We keep Dryad alive in our shared delusion, our collective false memories that feel more true than any individual truth. Sometimes I wonder who I was before. There are fragments, a name that might have been mine, a vague sense of running from something, but those pieces are fading, being replaced by stronger memories, better memories, memories of belonging. And maybe that's not so bad. Maybe forgetting who I was is a fair trade for remembering who we were. All of us. Together. In a town that doesn't exist on any current map but lives perfectly preserved in the rain-soaked memories of the people who can't leave. If you're ever driving through the Willapa Hills and you see a town called Dryad, don't stop. Don't stay longer than it takes to fill your gas tank, because the rain there remembers everything. And if you stay long enough, you'll start remembering too. Things that never happened to you, lives you never lived. And one day, you'll try to leave and realize you can't remember why you'd want to. You'll have been absorbed into something larger than yourself, something that needs you to keep existing. And the worst part is, you won't mind. You'll finally feel like you belong somewhere, even if that somewhere is a dying town that's been slowly erasing everyone who enters it for the last 70 years, replacing their memories with its own, keeping itself alive through collective delusion and constant rain. Those were all 11 stories from the darkest corners of the Pacific Northwest. If these tales made you question every shadow in your home, every sound in the woods, and every moment you spend alone, then you understand why these stories needed to be told. The Pacific Northwest doesn't forget. And now, neither will you. If you want more stories that will keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button on Bleak Fears and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below telling me which story disturbed you the most and where you're watching from. And remember, the next time you're alone in the dark, you might want to leave the lights on. I'll see you in the next video if you're brave enough to come back.